This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Donald Sultan. Sultan is a painter, sculptor, and printmaker who makes iconographic images with industrial materials. From the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, he produced a series of images called the disaster paintings that I'm an enormous fan of. His work can be found in every major collection in this country, and he has been the subject of solo exhibitions at a variety of museums, including the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art, LACMA, the Brooklyn Museum and MoMA. And now, my conversation with Donald Sultan. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Art Sense podcast. Donald, with artists, I usually like to start with a hypothetical, which is if you're at a dinner party and if by chance you were seated next to someone who had never heard of you or seen your work, how do you describe to them what you do and what your work looks like?
Well, I usually tell them to buy my book, look it over. But if they want a quick thing, I'll say basically I use iconographic images with industrial materials. That's what I say.
That takes on different forms, right? Your work traditionally has kind of been divided up into, I think, what you kind of group as artificial, natural, industrial. Are those themes that you kind of bounce back and forth, or?
Yeah, and they cross-pollinate, So, but in the main, all of those images are more or less treated the same way. They're all made with industrial materials, and they're all made to be work, representative of work, and standardization, and things that repeat. Except for the disaster pictures. But disasters also repeat, as we know. And people ask me now, why I don't revisit those disaster pictures. And I always say, well, right now and in the last few years, there have been so many disasters that it's sort of pointless. The images just speak for themselves. I don't have anything to add to the fact that everything that seems to be stable and permanent has been shown to not be. And so I don't have any more to add to that. And every day you see that this is true. So I've gone on to other things. So basically that's, the florals were more or less flowers that were raised in hothouses. They're not wildflowers. And images that I use are more or less geometric versions of the flower or the fruit that I'm using. The black lemons that were inserted into the still lives were more or less a kind of a memento mori, but on the other hand, they existed in the still life. I made those objects, the lemons and the eggs, black, and put them in there. So they existed just like the fruit. So that's kind of how to go talk about meanings versus architecture. About the structures and meanings are the paradox.
One of the things that I seem to come back to whenever I speak with artists is your work reflecting where you're from and reflecting your formative years. I don't think it's anything that is even necessarily conscious. Sometimes it's subconscious. And I've heard you talk about what life was like in your dad's tire shop in Asheville, North Carolina. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how there is some tactile things that were going on there that seem to really reflect your work today.
Well, I didn't grow up in a home that was white collar in the sense that they were working people. My father had a sort of a tire, not just a tire shop, but he had mobile tire trucks that went out and serviced vehicles, and they sold airplane tires, and he had his own company that made their own tire brand. But it was all hands-on, and he had a lot of men that worked for him, and I grew up working with those men. And so basically what I felt close to was having hands-on work, and never was that comfortable with just the sort of illustrative quality of painting and drawing. I wanted them to be actually physically exist in space as an object, and that could be handled and embraced. So sometimes I would feel like, I was really making an actual thing rather than just an illustration of a thing. And I'm consistently that way. I like the weight and structure of the made furniture of the art, and also the images on the surface, which are more or less the meaning. I mean, someone once described these things as boxcars that carry meaning, and the things on the front should have actual physical weight as well as visual weight to go with them. But with the physical weight and the eye of the viewer or the eye of the artist is placed in a way that has a dialogue, that's not just a freight car. So I like the two things, the heaviness of the structure, I call the architecture of the canvas or the panels, and the fragility of the meaning that's on the front of it. And that's, those gouged and drawn and heavy, and they should have visual and physical weight on the front as well as the back. That comes from a working class feeling of American art really as a hands-on, nail the spike in the railroad line work, not as opposed to video or something that's more ephemeral.
And I feel like sometimes I hear people use the word architectural when they refer to your work, because in most cases we're not talking about a stretched canvas. We're talking about a structure that you've built, right? And part of it's new materials. Most times there's repurposed materials. Can you tell me where did that start? Did that start in North Carolina or at the Art Institute, or when you got to New York in '75? When did you start building these structures to place these two?
I started when I came to New York building them, really, because when I was working in college and working in art school, I had devised methods of using plastic poured polymers and working into it or painting under it, so that there was a series that looked like you were looking at the bottom of a stream with a thick kind of plastic magnifier. But to do that when I moved meant that I had to have drums of polymer, and I lived in a walk-up, and I said, I'm not lugging barrels of polymer up the stairs. So I was trying to find a way to have the same kind of object that I would make, and I stumbled upon some guys working with linoleum tile, and I asked them how they cut them, and he told me how. And so I got some from them, and I went home and I started cutting images into it and more or less inlaying images into the tile. So I realized that to do that, I'd have to have a wooden structure to glue them to, because they're heavy. But they gave me the feeling of if I thought of it as paint, it gave me the feeling that I wanted. I could embrace the whole art. So from there, I actually inlaid linoleum floors for a couple of my friends for their kitchen. And so I started making larger versions by cutting and burning and inlaying imagery into the tile. And so over time, the structure that held that vertically, because most tiles are meant to be flat on the floor, I had to devise a glue that would hold them vertically. And then I started using the tar on the top instead of the blue glue you use to glue them on the floor. The black boulder, or whatever you call it, it's like a black glue for holding linoleum, but it won't work vertically. So I started flipping everything around, and I got between those two things, I had an enormous range. So instead of if I made a table that looked like a factory, I could actually cut the image out and put it in there. So you really had that image and that table. You didn't just have a drawing of it. And that's kind of where I pursued that feeling. I mean, my feeling of these, I had a book out called the Theater of the Object, which incorporated my training in theater. And I did design sets. I worked on sets. I did set painting, and I acted. And I was going to be in the theater. But so, in a way, these were also stages because I work on them flat and vertically, and they're standardized. So basically, I haven't moved off of that dime. I have done a couple of stretched canvases, and I like those too, but I didn't do very many of them. So, that's where that all comes from. It just comes from a feeling that, rather than, I don't really know how to say it. I really feel like every painting I make is like a human that you're actually embracing rather than just talking to.
There's a term that I hear thrown around a lot in art criticism, and that's a discussion of the picture plane. And I feel like that's something that I see you engaging with in your work. For the listener that maybe doesn't quite understand that dance, could you kind of maybe speak to how we see that at work in your pieces?
Well, the thing you're talking about is the picture plane, is whether it's flat or it has perspective distance. That's basically what they're talking about. So starting about the time of Pollock, flatness was what they were aiming for. So that it was removed from imitation. And over time, most contemporary art is, even if it uses figuration in a way, they tend to try to keep it flat. I've done paintings that I used, actually the perfect example of breaking that down was when I would take two pieces of linoleum that were striated, like a kind of a tan and a blue. I put them together and I had the sky and the sea. And you had incredible depth and you had absolutely flat surface. It was not really that, it was only an illusion. So that was a breakthrough in a way. I did a few of those. You can see that every now and then. There are certain places in Italy or other places where they take rock that they find and then they can polish it, and it's a landscape. And they were big in modernist furniture and architecture, in like Frank Lloyd Wright and so on. You could put these marble or these stone polished pieces over the mantle as a picture. And it really looks like a fantastic landscape, but it's just the rocks that form that look. And the linoleum did that. So I had some where I had the two put together, two pieces together, or maybe four pieces, depending on the size. And then I would take a hammer and knock a piece off the horizon where you could see the masonite it was glued to, and it looked like a land in the distance. So you had this incredible trompe l'oeil that was totally illusory. There was nothing could be flatter than a piece of linoleum. So that's basically the dialogue between the picture planes, how to do that. And sometimes in the disaster pictures, there's perspective in some of them. And I use 3-point perspective, basically the easiest perspective to draw, and which I considered standard, like the linoleum, I considered it a standard way of making depth. But mostly once they were done, the surface would be almost impenetrable and chaotic, and it was hard to make out the image. And I wanted that because the feeling of, if you're in a catastrophe when it's happening, it's confusing. And I wanted the paintings to be confusing in that way, so that you felt you were actually in the middle of that. But when I moved to doing the still life, the big still life paintings, I had to figure out how to make a giant still life not look like just a giant picture of a lemon, for example, like you'd see on a billboard. So normally when you see an 8-foot yellow lemon on a billboard, your mind would reduce it to the size of the lemon. You get the idea, it's a picture of a lemon. But this thing, by being so heavy and being put in that